Welcome to everyone, and thank you for joining me. We have a very important topic to discuss today on this webcast, which is essential oils and contagion. And specifically, what are some facts about this important subject, and what are some of the common misunderstandings that people have? As you probably imagine, this is a very complicated subject on many levels, and it takes us into areas of medicine, scientific research about what is both known and unknown about essential oils, into a discussion about self-care and home pharmacy, and into some political discussions about the FDA concerning natural products and what can and cannot be said about them. And of course, the scary topic of epidemics. So the major subjects that I would like to cover in this short talk are, first, an overview of the historical uses of aromatic plants and some of the early concepts of contagion and microbes. Second, an overview of some of the research that's been done on the antimicrobial powers of essential oils. Some of the mechanisms of how the oils actually work biochemically, and some of the very important challenges about using essential oils safely and effectively, such as the ratio between the dose and potential toxicity, and also some of the recent issues that have occurred with the FDA concerning companies that are making medical claims about essential oils, and this is specifically about essential oils being used for contagion. So this discussion is both about some of the facts that we know and also some of the misunderstandings or the fallacies or the fantasies about what essential oils can do or not do. So in that sense, this discussion is partly historical, it's partly scientific, it's a little bit philosophical, as I tend to get, and also a bit political, but this of course is just the nature of natural medicine. I think that some of you were probably expecting something medical, like simple answers about what oils we could use for treating what conditions. And those of you who have attended our events or maybe taken the newly released Pharmacy of Flowers course, you know that sometimes there are simple answers for taking care of ourselves with a home pharmacy and using essential oils for relatively uncomplicated health issues. But I also know from years of working in this field of natural medicine and specializing in the use of essential oils that many times people really have wildly unrealistic expectations of what herbs and essential oils can do. So some of you have heard about the question that comes up a lot that I call the grandmother question. And this is when people ask me something like, my grandmother is in her 80s and she's diabetic and she had cancer a few years ago and was on chemotherapy, and she's developing dementia, and she's got blood pressure problems, and she's having difficulty walking. And what's the essential oil for that? So I have heard this many, many times, and it's a very revealing question, actually, because in my mind, what this tells us is that we have become accustomed to thinking in terms of a magic bullet, and that of course is the thinking behind modern pharmaceutical medicine. And holistic medicine has a different kind of thinking, and so we always have to explain this thinking over and over and help people understand what essential oils can and cannot do. Now, there's a reason why we have this kind of thinking, and I've come to understand that there's basically two groups of people when it comes to beliefs about what natural medicine can do. And the first is there's a group that thinks that natural medicine can cure everything, and that all modern medicines are always to be avoided. And the second, and undoubtedly by far the larger group at this time in this country, are the people who just have unquestioning faith in modern medicine, and they're actually afraid of natural alternatives. But really, neither of these views are healthy, because there are many cases where health-conscious people may find themselves needing modern medicine, and they should use it. But there's even more cases where natural alternatives are easily available and just as effective, or in many cases more so than pharmaceuticals, and there's actually no need for starting down the road of pharmaceutical dependency. So this grandmother question then reveals something very important about our society right now, and that is that there's a widespread lack of understanding of how to take care of ourselves. We find ourselves in a situation where we basically have three sources of medical information available to us. The first is conventional pharmaceutical medicine, meaning our modern allopathic clinics and hospitals and doctors. And within this system, many doctors are becoming increasingly open-minded about holistic and natural alternatives, but many are not. And many actively discourage their patients from using things that are beneficial. I think that's where a lot of people find themselves, basically, in the modern clinic, getting information that doesn't really support alternatives. Now, the second source of medical information is if we have the ability to work with a holistic medical practitioner who does know about alternatives. And that can be a medical doctor who's trained and knowledgeable about holistic medicine. It could be a naturopath, a chiropractor, an acupuncturist, a trained herbalist. But unfortunately, the access to this level of holistic medicine is limited by several factors. Most of the practitioners are usually in urban areas. Most of these people have a cash practice, which means that people have to pay out of pocket. Insurance doesn't cover this. And often the really good practitioners are just booked up for a long time in advance. It's not like you can just make an appointment and go in to see them. You might have to wait 3 or 6 months. So then what we see is that this kind of high quality, trained, licensed, holistic level of medicine is really, I think it's accurate to say that it's almost like a luxury of the wealthy, because you have to oftentimes pay quite a bit out of pocket to get it. And also something that's really limited by where people are geographically. So that leaves people with the third and final source of medical information, which is what I call internet medicine. And internet medicine has basically two forms. There's the science, and then there's the marketing. Now, we can get a lot of very helpful information about healthcare through good medical and scientific websites. But when it comes to essential oils, there's a lot of confusion between what the scientific literature says and how this information is being used by companies for marketing purposes. And that's really one of the most important themes of this discussion, is untangling this confusion between what science says and what marketing says. And so as a result of this, there is a lot of misinformation and confusion in people's minds, because they're getting a lot of their information through the internet, where science and marketing are mixed up. And so I have another version of the grandmother question for you. And this is something that I've received several times recently. That is, what is the best essential oil for Ebola? Now, this question is the reason that I decided to give this talk, because that particular question and the issues that it raises has led to some very interesting and important developments in the essential oil industry here in the US. Specifically, the FDA has given 2 large essential oil companies warnings about the claims that they're making for the therapeutic actions of their products. Now, even though the science supports the claims in many cases, stating that the use of essential oils can treat such and such a condition takes the discussion into the realm of a medical modality, and therefore is legal only if it's practiced by licensed medical practitioners. So some of you might be disappointed at the information that I'm giving here, because what it boils down to is that there aren't any easy answers. There are no easy answers when it comes to contagious diseases, especially something like Ebola, which is classed as a level 4 biohazard, which is the highest level. So we might be able to see certain solutions that appear relatively easy on the surface, such as testing an essential oil in a petri dish against a particular strain of a microbe. But the human body and the conditions in the world and life in general are infinitely more complicated. So will I tell you the best oil for Ebola? No. But what I will tell you is the complexities and challenges in the field of herbal medicine, rather than give you specific solutions such as this oil treats this condition. Now, in my opinion, understanding how complicated this subject is really the beginning of a truly holistic approach to safely and effectively using essential oils. And I imagine that most of you watching this probably know by now that this has been my message for many years. So let's get started by getting a little historical perspective on the broader subject of contagion and aromatic plants. What we know is that traditional medical systems did not know the details of microbiology. The germ theory and the discovery of the microbial world didn't happen until the 1800s. However, the traditional doctors did have a conceptual understanding of pathogens and microbes, even though they couldn't see them. For example, Tibetan medicine has a term called windworms, which describes airborne pathogens. And the term krimi in Ayurveda is specifically about worms, but it's also a generic term for pathogens. And Chinese medicine also has concepts of pathogens, using terms like wind heat and wind cold for things that are transmitted through the atmosphere. Now, it's interesting to note when we do this research that there's a strong link between the classical concepts of contagion and aromas and our sense of smell. So here we can ask, well, what is the biological function of our sense of smell? Why do we have a nose in the center of our face? 2 basic reasons. The first is to inform us of good things that we want, and the second is to warn us of bad things that we don't want. The most basic good things are the smells of delicious foods, and at a more subtle level, an attraction to a genetically appropriate mate. Now, this particular mating function is highly developed in many animals. It's interesting to note that research recently has found that this function is no longer operational, however, in most human males, which means that females probably have more discriminating intelligence when it comes to relationships at this olfactory level. Now, olfactory warnings of bad things protect us from danger. The most important are things like the smell of smoke indicating fire and smells of rotten foods. So the loss of smell, which is known as anosmia, is therefore not only the loss of enjoyment and pleasure of enjoying the sensory world and taste of things as well as smelling them, but it can actually be a serious problem, a dangerous situation. Now, even though the traditional medical systems such as Ayurveda and Chinese medicine didn't know specifics about microbes as we do now, they did understand contagion. They saw epidemics spreading through the population, and they made a strong association with the spread of illness and bad smells. So sewage and rotting garbage and sick people, environmental pollution, all of these things reveal the presence of proliferating microbial toxins. So without knowing the details of the pathogens that were there, people understood that there were bad vapors, and that where there were bad vapors, that there were diseases. And so these bad vapors, or evil spirits, or evil qi, as it's said in Chinese medicine, were synonymous with what people could tell, perceive through the olfactory sense. Malaria, for example, is a term that means just that. It means mal aria, meaning bad air. And malaria specifically proliferates in places where there's a lot of stagnant water. So historically, the aromatic plants have always been the primary antidote for these evil spirits. And this is easy to understand conceptually. On one level, it's just as simple as covering up the bad smells with good ones. But on a more complex level, it raises the question of, well, why do aromatic plants produce aromatic molecules? And I'm sure that many of you know by now that this is a biological function in plants that has to do with their immune system. Specifically, essential oils, the aromatic compounds, are the immune intelligence of these plants. And they use these compounds to protect themselves from the same pathogens that we're exposed to. And so therefore, using aromatic plants for prevention and treatment of contagious diseases is more than just a cosmetic removal of bad smells. We know now from the science that these aromatic compounds actually work to kill the pathogens, and therefore to purify the atmosphere, not just make it smell good, but to actually microbially purify it. This is very important. Now, if we look at the history, we find that aromatic plants have been used by humans for a very long time in many forms. This is one of the things that I enjoy about these presentations, is doing the research and telling you some things that I find. Now, one study I found says that bedding from the Stone Age settlements from 77,000 years ago were made with aromatic plants that had insecticidal properties. So that's long use of aromatic plants. And we also find that the use of bedding for animals in many cultures around the world also tends to be with aromatic plants. Throughout old Europe, and probably in many other parts of the world, strewing herbs such as lavender were put on the floor. Camphor was burned during the plagues in in medieval Europe. Of course, there's been the use of frankincense and other resins for thousands of years, and burned by the kilos in homes and churches and temples and mosques. And we still see this in India, where there's the tradition of the fire puja, where people gather for prayers inside these big clouds of aromatic smoke from the offerings, which I like to refer to as a kind of group vaccination. And in South America, we still see that the Palo Santo is burned daily for repelling mosquitoes, as well as purification and the psychoactive effects during healing ceremonies. There's the tradition of the sweat lodge, which is fairly universal, where aromatic plants are used in the water and on the rocks. And I'm sure that bathing with aromatic plants is undoubtedly as probably as old as we are. And we also see that in many parts of the world that aromatic gardens were planted around homes to protect them. So before distillation came along, the essential oils were extracted primarily by soaking the plants in carrier oils. And this gave a wide range of medicinal and cosmetic products such as unguents and lotions and massage oils and perfumes. And then when distillation started about 700 AD, about over 1,000 years ago, we got hydrosols, perfumed waters, and essential oils that started to be used increasingly. So this started with the distillation of rose oil, and as more and more essential oils were discovered, they became highly esteemed by the classical physicians. It's also interesting to note historically that because of their antimicrobial effects, the essential oil containing spices were one of the primary methods of treatment and food preservation, and that is what led to the search for the New World. So really, this continent was so-called discovered because of the search for essential oil containing plants. So there's lots of research about how these things are still being used and actually developed in modern times. For example, one study that I found that I like to mention is that comes from beekeepers, and they're finding that if they put the beehives over a ground cover of an aromatic species like thyme, that it actually protects the mites, protects the bees from the varroa mite, which is an epidemic that the bees have. So here we can ask a fairly obvious question about aromatic plants and contagion. That is, if people of the past were using so many essential oil containing plants, why were there so many horrible epidemics? Now we could ask that question actually about any epidemic in any medical system. We could ask, if there are so many good immune boosting herbs in China, then why is there an epidemic of cancer there now? We could also ask, if there's so many good antiviral drugs available, why is there an epidemic of Ebola? So the answer is relatively simple, which is that infectious epidemics are not caused by microbes alone. In order for the microbe to flourish, there must be numerous conditions in the environment and in the economy and in society that are conducive for the microbe to spread. And if we understand this idea more fully, it can help us to have a truly holistic view on the role that medicinal plants, and specifically the aromatic ones, can play in healing. So there's a wonderful and very profound passage that was written about 2,500 years ago by the Ayurvedic physician Charak. And I like to quote this. It's actually about how epidemics are started. And what Charak said was, epidemics are caused by corruption in the government. He didn't say epidemics are caused by microbes. He said it's because governments are corrupt. And what he did was he traced a series of causes and effects, karma as it were, through a whole chain. And he said that basically when there's moral deterioration within the government, the leaders are affected by greed and dishonesty, and then the population is led astray, basically. And there's a breakdown of spiritual culture. And when there's a breakdown of spiritual culture, then heat toxins begin to accumulate in the atmosphere. Now, I find this very interesting because he wrote about heat toxins accumulating in the atmosphere 2,500 years ago. This is basically a prediction of global warming coming from a kind of spiritual breakdown of society. And when these heat toxins accumulate, weather patterns are disturbed. And when the weather patterns are disturbed, then the rain doesn't come on time, and there's drought, and there's flooding, and the crops don't grow, and people become hungry. And when people are hungry, they become weakened immunologically, and then they are susceptible to epidemics. And so this is a very old and very astute observation about the link between politics and the environment and society and infectious contagious conditions. Now we can see this at work in modern times. For example, well, historically, if we look at medieval Europe, we see that the primary cause of the infectious epidemics was because of a feudal society where the majority of the population lived in extremely filthy conditions. And in the case of Ebola, we can see that the governments are actually at the top of the chain of this cause and effect, because the virus has been known for decades, a long time, that no drugs have been developed. And this is political, because this is something that affects Africans. We also see that in these countries that the healthcare systems have been destroyed because of economic austerity programs. And so there's a reason why this epidemic has gotten out of control, and that is that the healthcare system has been dismantled very deliberately by outside political forces. We see in China, for example, that the government obviously bears a huge responsibility for the degradation of the environment that is at the root of the cancer epidemic. So what do we do with this macro view of epidemics? Now, ever since I lived in Kathmandu, where I was studying Ayurvedic and Tibetan medicine, I've had a very acute awareness that no individual can remain healthy in a toxic world. And I've also had a level of understanding that it's not actually the medical care that determines the overall health of society. It's primarily due to the level of nutrition and hygiene. So our country is a good example of this, because we have probably the most sophisticated treatments and drugs available in the world, but there's an epidemic of chronic degenerative diseases that are linked to poor nutrition and high levels of toxicity. So therefore, in my mind, when we talk about essential oils and contagion, I think that we should view essential oils really as the final end result in a long chain of healing processes that go all the way back to the organic farms and production of high quality, locally available food and sustainable agroforestry and all the things that are helping to take care of the environment. Because we cannot expect any form of medicine, natural or otherwise, to really help us much if we don't start cleaning up the environment. And supporting ecological agriculture in this way is, in my mind, one of the best ways to do it. So here's a little quote. Some of you might have come across this. I wrote this a while back that kind of sums up this vision about the role of plants and healing in removing the root causes of contagion and epidemics. When peaceful cities are blessed with myriad sweet floral scents, when healthy forests are filled with balsamic coniferous perfumes, when farms are enveloped with the earthy aromas of healthy soil and robust crops, when homes are infused with temple essences that bring joy and tranquility, we will understand why the ancients taught that plants were gifts from heaven. So this is quite utopian, of course, but why not? I think it's better than a lot of the ideas that are out there now. So with this historical background, we have a good sense of how important the aromatic plants and their essential oil compounds have been for millennia. Now, in my opinion, really, we have not even started to tap the potential of what essential oils can be used for. But knowing the historical importance of the aromatic plants can guide us toward greater health and well-being in many simple ways, which is what we are advocating. For example, and this is very common sense, the more time we spend in the fresh air and around fragrances of plants, such as the conifer forest, or our aromatic gardens, the stronger our immune system will be compared to spending a lot of time inside with toxic vapors and in close proximity to a lot of sick people. And this is why we spend so much time advocating the use of diffusers in the home, because it's really the simplest way to duplicate that aromatic atmosphere of being in a clean forest or a garden. Here's a short story to illustrate this point. Last year, Sarah and I spent the winter in a cabin in the Sierra Nevada mountains of California. And during that period of about 6 months, from September to February, we spent a lot of time in the high country, around 10,000 feet, harvesting and distilling the conifers of the forest. And during those months down in civilization, there was a major and prolonged flu epidemic. So needless to say, all the work in the fresh air combined with being in close proximity to truckloads of conifer oils, truckloads of needles and freshly distilled essential oils prevented us from catching the flu that everyone else had. It wasn't until we went back to civilization and got on a train with a lot of sick people on a cross-country trip that it finally caught up with us. Now here I can answer a question that might be crossing your mind, which is, if essential oils are so good for the immune system, why can't you get on a train with sick people and not get sick? The answer is that it's not only protecting ourselves that is important, because everybody's going to get sick at some point. It's also how quickly and fully we recover. So in our case, our recovery was fast and complete, while many people that we know had numerous relapses and long downtimes during this epidemic. So let's turn our attention now to what modern research tells us about essential oils. And what we'll find is that we have a lot of scientific confirmation of the powers of aromatic plants that people have known about for thousands of years and just used intuitively. We have the scientific understanding of how many of the oils and compounds within them function at a biochemical level. So there's a wealth of research into the antimicrobial powers of essential oils. If we start reading through all these reports, we might start to get the impression that essential oils can kill every type of unwanted pathogen and organism. For example, we find that just tea tree oil alone, has documentation showing that it's effective against multiple species of fungi, against candida and yeasts, against scabies and lice and mites and ticks, and of course bacteria and viruses. Not only do these reports show that just this one oil is highly effective against these pathogens and organisms, but that they are effective against strains that have developed resistance to drugs and treatments. So if we look further, we find that hundreds of other essential oils have also been tested with similar kinds of results. And it goes even further. For example, one research project in South Africa studying the Cymbopogon validus, which is known as the African bluegrass oil, found that this oil not only has all the usual antibacterial, antifungal, and antiseptic powers, but also significant powers to repel mosquitoes, kill their larvae, and to repel rodents. Additionally, it was found to have powers that are commonly found in essential oil research, which is that it has powerful antioxidant and anti-aging effects. Other oils, such as niuli, which is a type of melaleuca and therefore a member of the tea tree family, have great insecticidal properties that are superior to numerous commercial products. So we can start to see that essential oils represent a huge and largely underutilized source of treatments and products for a wide range of conditions, not just for humans, but also for veterinary medicine and agriculture, for food preservation, alternatives to toxic chemicals, and on and on. So we can ask, well, why are they not being used more for these purposes, especially for new natural medicines? And the simple answer, and something that we discuss frequently at our events, and many times we've had discussions about this with our products, is that essential oils are not very user-friendly. The entire art and science of aromatherapy really is just taking a huge amount of plant material and distilling it into a very small amount of concentrated liquid that is not biocompatible, and then finding ways to dilute it back to biocompatible levels again. So what are some of the problems of using essential oils for microbial pathogens and anti-contagion purposes? There's basically three major challenges. The first is that the science of what an oil works against, what strain of microbe, is very complicated and very specific. The second is that there's a huge difference between in vitro actions of oils, meaning in a petri dish, and in vivo, meaning in the body. And the third is, because of the highly concentrated nature of essential oils, even small doses can cause adverse reactions on the skin or in the GI tract. So let's look here at some of these reports to get an idea of the complexities of the science here. Here's a report that's titled Comparative Study on the Antiviral Activity of Selected Monoterpenes Derived from Essential Oils. This comes from the Department of Virology, the Hygiene Institute, University of Heidelberg in Germany. The study says essential oils from eucalyptus, tea tree, and thyme and their major monoterpene compounds were examined for their antiviral activity against herpes simplex virus type 1, HSV1, in vitro, in a petri dish. So in vitro is one of the most important sources of misinterpretation of these reports when it comes to internet medicine, which I will explain. So the study says these essential oils were able to reduce viral infectivity by greater than 96%, and the monoterpenes inhibited HSV by about greater than 80%. So in other words, complete essential oils were more effective than isolated compounds. And this is a common observation of these reports. And the reason for this is easy to understand. It's because a complete essential oil contains many compounds, not just an isolated ingredient, and therefore represents a more sophisticated and complex immune system and a biochemical attack against the pathogens. So the approach of isolating specific compounds, which we find is really the system that was developed with antibiotics and with pesticides, is how the organisms learn to mutate and to become resistant. So the study goes on and says the mode of antiviral action has been determined. Only moderate antiviral effects were revealed by essential oils and monoterpenes when these drugs were added to host cells prior to infection or after entry of HSV into cells. However, both essential oils and monoterpenes exhibited high anti-HSV1 activity by direct inactivation of free virus particles. All tested drugs interacted in a dose-dependent manner with herpes virus particles, thereby inactivating viral infection. Now, this is extremely important, and I will explain it. What this means is that the oils only had a moderate protective effect on cells that were not yet infected or after they were infected, but that the oils were highly effective directly on the virus particle. In other words, they're not so great in the body once the virus is in our system, but they're very effective directly on the virus. This is where a lot of the confusion is coming from in internet medicine and marketing. So let's pause here and remember that the majority of the studies that are published about the antimicrobial effects of oils are these in vitro tests directly against a strain of pathogen. Now, the method that's used is to cultivate a standardized strain of a microbe in a petri dish and then expose it to a source of essential oil, such as a soaked blotter paper, and see what the die-off rate is. Therefore, one of the most fundamental problems with using essential oils for medical purposes is that this type of test, which is the most common, doesn't tell us what the oil will do in the body or at what levels it would be necessary to effectively inhibit or eradicate an organism. So if I were trying to translate this information to something practical without making any kind of medical claims about using essential oils to treat a particular illness, I would say that the most obvious application of this information is that essential oils are great for cleaning surface areas where viral particles could be passed on to others. And we can also assume that at high enough concentrations in the atmosphere, that essential oils will also attack airborne pathogens. And that's the idea behind using diffusers. Now here's another typical introduction that we find in these essential oil studies. It says, and this is from a study on Melissa officinalis, okay, which is lemon balm. It starts off by saying extracts and essential oils of medicinal plants are increasingly of interest as novel drugs of antimicrobial and antiviral agents, since herpes virus might develop resistance to commonly used antiviral agents. So there's widespread recognition that essential oils represent a huge untapped resource of new medications. So the antiviral effect of lemon balm oil on herpes simplex virus was examined, and I'll just paraphrase the study here. It said only 0.0004 dilution was needed to inhibit the virus. So that's an extremely dilute amount, 0.0004%. That's almost all water to inhibit the virus, while at higher concentrations, the lemon balm oil abolished the viral infectivity nearly completely. So this study also did this pre-treatment, and they found the same thing with the cells, which is that the oil is good for the virus as long as it hadn't gotten into the cells. So we can start to see here the complexities in using antimicrobial actions of essential oils, because once the virus is in us, it becomes much harder to treat. Okay, so we find a lot of similar reports like this. Same institute found the same results with peppermint oil. Another study on leptospermum oil, which is known as lemon-scented tea tree, which is also manuka oil. It had an inhibitory effect on herpes simplex 1 virus once it had penetrated into the cells, but not on herpes simplex 2. So what this tells us is that the essential oils have very specific effects against specific microbes and not others, even though they can be closely related. And there's lots of studies indicating this, where an oil is tested against multiple bacterial or viral pathogens, and the results indicate that some strains are highly susceptible, and some are moderately susceptible, and some are not susceptible. For example, the essential oil of Eucalyptus globulus was found to be most effective for Haemophilus influenza and Haemophilus parainfluenza, followed in effectiveness by Streptococcus pneumonia, but the oil's antiviral action against mumps was very weak. Therefore, if we say that essential oils have antimicrobial effects, we have to further clarify and qualify that statement by saying that it depends on the oil, the microbe, and the stage of exposure and infection. So what does this mean for using essential oils in a non-medical way, where we're not making claims such as this oil will kill such and such a virus or cure such and such a bacterial infection? So the approach that I've been advocating for many years is based on the same principle as the story that I told you about how Sarah and I avoided the flu epidemic by working in the conifer trees last winter. And I've said many times, and it's completely correct, that essential oils are the distilled immune system of plants. If we bring the oils into our homes and use them in various ways, we will receive their benefits, even without knowing which oil works on which microbe at what stage of exposure or replication. Now, the more diverse the collection of oils we use, and the more ways that we use them, the higher the likelihood that they'll be giving us broad spectrum protection. So now we come to the most complicated aspect of applying essential oils for medical purposes. And I've already touched on this, about how most of the research studies are based on in vitro tests, meaning testing on how cultivated strains of microbes respond to exposure to essential oils in a petri dish. But whatever actions the oils might have against microbes in a petri dish, those actions will become infinitely more complex and unpredictable when they're used on or in the human body. The human body is not a petri dish. It's composed of billions of sensitive cells, all of which can react to the contact of essential oils in a myriad ways. And furthermore, it requires very small amounts of an essential oil to cause intense reactions. Think of putting a drop of something like oregano oil on your tongue where it can burn seriously. Now, let's be clear about this point. This kind of caustic response of the tissues is not a detox reaction. This is an inflammatory reaction. And any person who tells you otherwise has been taught erroneous information. And so the most basic problem then is that a very small difference between the dosage, there is a very small difference between a dosage that can be beneficial and one that can be harmful. Now, I've heard countless stories about how essential oils have caused inflammatory responses through improper use. Now, at the same time, people also swear that they consume them internally with nothing but beneficial reactions. So how do we explain this? The answer is very simple. The same small dose of a drop or two can cause a wide range of reactions in different people, depending on their sensitivity. So one drop of oregano oil ingested internally may be wonderful for one person getting a sore throat, but it can cause horrible problems for someone with gastritis. So here's a simple example of this confusion that arises between in vitro studies and in vivo applications from my personal experience. A number of in vitro studies have found that oregano oil is highly effective against a number of organisms that cause intestinal infections. The interpretation of this in internet medicine, of course, is that you can take oregano oil for intestinal infections, including parasites. Now, when there's an infection by pathogenic microbes in the intestines, the symptoms are caused primarily by the secretion by those microbes of acidic polysaccharides, which they use as their favored medium to thrive in. These acidic secretions, in turn, cause an inflammatory response in the mucous membranes of the digestive tract, and this is what causes the symptoms. So, some of you might know that I've had plenty of experience treating my own intestinal infections as a result of living in India and Nepal and studying Ayurveda. So I heard about the antibacterial effects of oregano oil. I knew for a fact that I had bacterial infection. I took some capsules of it to attack the microbes, and instead it attacked my already inflamed GI tract. Because what my system needed was soothing, demulcent, anti-inflammatory herbs that were rich in mucilaginous compounds like licorice and marshmallow and aloe vera, and not caustic essential oils full of irritant phenolic compounds. So here's the primary problem. The oils may have great in vitro antimicrobial effects, but microbial infections tend to cause inflammation. And essential oils coming in contact with inflamed tissues have a high likelihood of increasing the inflammation further. So we can say that using essential oils for certain types of infections is like treating fire with fire. Now, there's certainly an important place for essential oils in the treatment of infections, but this is in the realm of advanced herbology. There's different systems of medical aromatherapy where people can learn the correct way of measuring essential oils in a proper carrier, proper dilution, the proper way of administering for a specific length of time for a specific medical condition, combining them with other herbs to make them safe and biocompatible. But this is advanced herbal training. And for those of you who are now wondering, yes, I am thinking about how to make this level of training available. So many different companies and labs are experimenting with how to make essential oils more biocompatible. Now, the basic problem with oils using this modern scientific terminology is that we need to increase the water solubility of the oils increase their stability, increase their bioavailability, and decrease their volatility. So this is obviously a fairly complicated technical and chemical challenge, but some interesting developments are taking place that could give us soon some essential oil products that might actually be widely used in medicine. But in the meantime, we can accomplish these chemical objectives at the grassroots healthcare home pharmacy level by using essential oils carefully in dilute form. So for example, we can make oils water soluble when we put them in the bath with an emulsifier like milk. We can increase their stability and decrease their volatility when we mix them in a carrier oil for massage and body applications. And we can increase their bioavailability when we use them in a diffuser or do direct palm inhalation. So even though there's a lot of complexities with using essential oils in medical practice, they're still relatively easy to use at the home pharmacy level if we just follow basic safety guidelines. So let's not attempt to practice advanced medicine with oils, okay? Let's not put ourselves at risk. Let's just use them simply. So we know through long history that many oils, such as the conifer oils, eucalyptus oils, have a well-established track record of safety, that the relaxing and uplifting effects of flower oils are very well established for centuries. The tissue regenerating effects of helichrysum are well established, and on and on. So let's just use the oils in simple ways in the home and not try to practice heroic measures for complicated conditions based on something we learned in a weekend. So now we come to the last section, and this is political in nature, and it concerns some recent developments with the FDA and essential oil companies. Two multi-level marketing companies of essential oils received warning letters from the FDA. Since this is common knowledge in the aromatherapy world, and because these letters are posted online and in the public domain, I'm going to name the two companies, Young Living and doTERRA. These were not the only companies to receive warnings, but they were the two that market the essential oils. Now, the reason that the warning letters were sent were claims that were being made about the antiviral powers of essential oils for preventing or treating Ebola. Now, this same thing happened a few years ago with the N1H1 bird flu scare. And at that time, a number of other companies and websites were targeted by the FDA, including Dr. Andrew Weil, for stating that traditional Chinese herbal formulas had immune-boosting powers against viral contagion. Now, at this point, everybody should understand and be clear about how the FDA operates. When a new epidemic starts, or there's a fear of one, they will type a word into Google, such as Ebola, and see how many companies or healthcare practitioners are saying that they can cure it or prevent it. So in the case of Young Living and doTERRA, the warning was given for both their company websites and for the claims made on the websites of their distributors, who had received that information through company training and literature. Some of these claims were pretty bold. For example, quote, "Viruses, including Ebola, are no match for Young Living oils." So again, we see that these claims were based on the confusion between in vitro and in vivo. Quote, "The Ebola virus cannot survive in the presence of cinnamon bark oil, which is in thieves' blend." So what are people going to do with this information from internet medicine? Are they going to put cinnamon oil directly on their skin? Are they going to drink it? Are they going to give it by IV to someone who is infected with the Ebola virus that is replicating in the brain and the blood? One distributor gave the advice that if Ebola was, quote, going around my neighborhood, they would apply thieves' blend to the bottom of the feet and the armpits for protection and take regular doses internally. Now, in my opinion, this is the worst of internet medicine. But the responsibility really lies with the companies that are teaching these things to their distributors. Now, Ebola was only the trigger for this response and the scrutiny by the FDA, but on these sites, long lists of outrageous claims were made about essential oils being able to treat almost everything, including cancer, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, autism, brain injury, multiple sclerosis, paralysis, and more. Needless to say, it was probably a big shock to these distributors to be contacted by the FDA, because after all, they were only repeating information that they were told by what they thought was a reputable source, their company. So let's look at a few further details here about what the issues are. We know so far that you cannot take in vitro findings and make in vivo claims. We also know that you cannot make claims about the medical efficacy about any product unless it has gone through an extensive multi-million-dollar testing process to become approved as a drug by the FDA. We also know that since you cannot patent an herb or an essential oil, you can't afford to have it approved as a drug. Now, the reason that the FDA came down on these companies was because of the way that they have translated in vitro evidence about essential oils into in vivo applications and then stated that they can be used as drugs for treating it. Specifically, to quote the FDA letters, because they are articles intended for use in the diagnosis, cure, mitigation, treatment, or prevention of disease. So, as you can probably tell by now, I am against the kind of fraudulent and dangerous education that multi-level marketing companies have been propagating about essential oils. So I'm not entirely against the FDA giving these companies these warnings. But in reading these letters, I was also struck by the hypocrisy of the FDA in this matter. At the end of this one section that I just quoted you, there's a very interesting statement, quote, the FDA approves a new drug on the basis of scientific data and information demonstrating that the drug is safe and effective. Now, let's be honest. Even people within the FDA would have to admit that over the years they've approved a lot of drugs that are neither safe nor effective. And this is the reason that people are desperate for alternatives to pharmaceutical drugs and why this kind of internet medicine is thriving. So this statement is not only factually incorrect, it's actually hypocritical, because herbal medicine fits their own description of what should be approved, because there's a huge amount of, quote, scientific data and information demonstrating that the drug is safe and effective. All right. Now, while I was preparing for this talk, I went through and analyzed these warning letters from the FDA, and I wrote out detailed responses about of the pros and cons about their policies. I wondered, for example, if the FDA is so interested in protecting the health of the public, why don't they ban sodas and junk food and GMO ingredients and all the things that are known causes of cancer and heart disease and the other leading killers in this country? I learned a lot from this process, but I quickly became weary of this political aspect of natural medicine, and so I'm sure that if I went on and on about this, that you would become weary also. Now, my interest is much more in folk medicine traditions, as most of you probably know, and how to use these traditions wisely. So let's just stay out of this conflict and learn how to empower ourselves without trying to practice medicine without a license. For those of you who are interested in the complexities of this topic, you can find these letters from the FDA online. So my primary motivation for giving this talk is to protect the integrity of natural medicine and the availability of essential oils for home pharmacy use by counteracting the ignorance and fraudulent marketing that is happening about them. The warning letters from the FDA to these two multi-level marketing companies give us an excellent opportunity to discuss the widespread misinformation that's being propagated about the powers of essential oils, which is coming from four things, which we now know. One, not understanding the differences between in vitro and in vivo uses. Two, not understanding the narrow range between therapeutic and toxic doses. Three, attempting to use essential oils for complex medical conditions without proper medical training. And four, taking advantage of people's need for natural medicine in ways that are unethical. Now, everyone is entitled to natural medicine. Plants are humanity's oldest form of medicine. And essential oils are a highly concentrated form, which means that they are both highly effective, but also require a higher level of care and knowledge in using less concentrated forms of plant medicine. So as users of natural medicine, we should understand that there is medical aromatherapy, which requires advanced training, but there are countless ways of using essential oils safely and effectively in our home pharmacies without training as well. As the owner of an essential oil company, I have a medical and ethical responsibility to advise people to stay away from medical uses and making medical claims about essential oils unless you are properly trained or working with someone who is. Personally, I think there's a great potential for essential oils to be used in a clinical setting for complex conditions once a higher level of knowledge and understanding and experience about medical aromatherapy has been reached by more trained and qualified practitioners. Now, in the bigger picture, we can see that aromatic plants have played a huge role in human health throughout history, and that confirmation of their therapeutic effects as herbal medicines are well documented. We can also see that a vast amount of scientific evidence is now available that confirms that the essential oils of aromatic plants have powerful antimicrobial effects, many of which are more effective than drugs that are losing their potency because of microbial mutation and adaptation. We can see that through simple and safe uses of essential oils, we can begin to enjoy the benefits of bringing the aromatic plants into our homes. We should also understand that the field of aromatherapy, specifically medical aromatherapy, is still in its infancy, and that we will be seeing many medical advances in safe and effective delivery systems that overcome the inherent problems with the essential oils, specifically their concentration and biocompatibility. In the meantime, all of us are responsible for using oils safely in simple and effective ways. So in closing, my advice for all of us is that we should educate ourselves more and get more experience with using the oils following the simple protocols for safe home pharmacy level use. There's no better way to know about the anti-contagion benefits of aromatic plants than to get through a flu epidemic with either no symptoms or minor symptoms and a rapid recovery, just using folk medicine and not needing antibiotics. I cannot legally or ethically tell you that eucalyptus oil has antiviral properties that can cure influenza. But if you are one of countless people around the world who have found for the last 100 years that breathing the oil during a respiratory infection was helpful, you already know what the oil can do. So, thank you again for joining me. And thank you especially for your interest in this very important subject. Stay tuned for more, because Sarah and I will be doing more frequent educational webcasts. And also, many thanks to everyone at Floracopeia who works so hard to make all of this possible. So until next time.
This has been a production of Floracopeia. Visit us at floracopeia.com for more courses like this and to experience the world's finest essential oils.